If I feel like, oh, I'm dumb if I can't do this, then I don't want to approach it. I'm not even going to try it. And I'm going to quit if I make a mistake. And Carol Dweck's research on growth mindset sort of shows that if you teach people that you're not dumb if you don't understand something, that that's part of the learning process. You're not supposed to know things, that you grow over time by trying things and asking for help. When you're trying to explain these skills and then model and role play them, they're not always understanding your verbal explanation. What if we took pictures and showed them rather than just explain it to them with words, and then we can model it and role play it? So we started creating these picture books for the kids in those programs, and and the pictures were really sort of right and wrong way to do particular skills, whether it's join in and play, start a conversation, how and when to interrupt, to ask for help, all kinds of things. And it was really the skills that were needed for those kids in those programs. So one of the things we found is when we used to really, work hard to try to get the attention of kids to try to teach skills. And what we found is, we do these little picture books, and then we'd say to the kids, well, it's your free time now, do what you'd like. And many of them would just go naturally to the picture books and start imitating what they saw in the books. And the teachers and I would look at each other and think, we're killing ourselves trying to get their attention to learn skills, and now they're just doing it by themselves. And so we suddenly realized this was a really easier way and had great sort of motivational appeal to kids to be able to use these picture books. So we sent it out to a publisher, and sure enough, the picture book for young kids became one of the top 10 autism books in the country back then, to our surprise, and because it was never even meant to be published. And then, of course, a portion of any proceeds went back to the programming for those kids back then. So the feedback we've gotten from parents like yourself is that, this is a book that I don't necessarily have to, sit down and force my kid to sort of learn or read. They kind of do it on their own sometimes. And in fact, now we try to get kids to make their own picture books. There's a great app called Pictello. And Pictello is an app where you can sort of import photographs and import word callouts and thought bubbles and help people sort of create their own picture books. But the picture books that we have, both for young kids and the one for high school and beyond, are about 30 or so skill lessons sort of ready to use. And can give people sort of an idea of how they could then use that format to go on and make their own picture books tailored to situations that they need to address.
Yeah, I love that because I asked Joseph because he used the picture book for the high school for the social skills, and I said, well, what do you remember about that? That's about 10, 12 years ago, and he said it was a nice, easy reference. And some of the things like what you were talking about exactly is I don't know how to read people. I don't know when I can tell if somebody really wants to include me in a group conversation. All those things, those little social cues, that are so hard. So that's exactly what he said about it. It was a nice, easy reference book.
Yeah, well, the thing about pictures is number one, they can make concrete what otherwise is sort of esoteric, abstract information, So you can stop the action with a photograph and read people's faces. When I do this, how do people react? When I do that, how do people react? And you can sort of see it in photograph form. You can also see visually some things that often, one has to sort of just do in their head. So, example, what's the point of sharing for a young kid with autism? Like if you tell a kid to share from their point of view, you're just stealing their potato chips. But if you can see in a picture book that if I give up my potato chips, I get back chocolate covered pretzels. Oh, okay. Now I get it. There's
Yeah.
something in it for me. And so these invisible payoffs to social skills become much more visible and concrete through the picture book. So that was the point of those books.
in the autism community, I hear a lot from moms about these meltdowns. And as our children get older and they have these meltdowns, it that out of control behavior is very scary.
Yeah.
Would you tell us about the book and share with us your best strategies that moms out there can start using with their children with autism?
So the first order of business, so maybe I'll sort of carve this into a variety of steps here. So, and maybe we'll look at sort of three steps to this. Step one is, how do you help parents think about difficult behavior in a way that leads to better outcome? And there's research on this, right? So that if parents are hopeful when they're confronted with really difficult behavior, they continue to do the things that they need to do to get to better outcomes. You have to sort of you have to look at problem behavior in a solvable way and in a way that leads to practical solutions. What we really talk about in the book is sort of understanding um, problem behavior, repeat problems, blow ups, etc., as defined really as a gap between the demands you're placing on an individual and their ability to cope with those demands. If you see it that way, it's very practical. There's a couple things you can do. You can modify the demands you're placing on an individual, and you can improve their coping skills, get them ready for the things that trigger them. If, on the other hand, you see it as sort of willful misbehavior, we often go down a discipline road where we want to then sort of punish our kids because they know better and yet they kept doing it. And the issue with punishment and discipline is it kind of works fine for regulated kids. If you're a logical kid, you get it. Mom's going to be mad if I do this. I'll be in trouble. I better not do it. But if you have trouble with emotional regulation and you're not being logical in those moments, you're being instead hijacked by the Incredible Hulk. Your Dr. Banner brain isn't really all there. And at the moment, you're just the Incredible Hulk. Hulk is not doing some logical thinking. Hulk is really about fight, flight, or freeze. When I'm threatened, I'm going to run, I'm going to hide, I'm going to shut down, or I'm going to fight. And if you try to do sort of a traditional discipline or punishment kind of approach there, the Hulk doesn't take well to threat. In fact, you will get more Hulk behavior, escalating problems. So the first step is kind of like moving beyond that traditional discipline to understanding when I have a repeat problem, let's not just keep going down the discipline road if it's actually getting worse for the Incredible Hulk. Let's instead think about, okay, what are the demands we're placing that kind of triggered this person into that Hulk-like behavior, and then how do I teach them to get ready for those triggers to improve their coping skills? So that's all step one to sort of how to think about this. Step two is like, what do you do with the Incredible Hulk when you don't even know what put them into that meltdown mode? So what helps the Incredible Hulk? Well, like I said, it doesn't help the Incredible Hulk to threaten them, to have military assault helicopters come and say, Hulk, put the car down or we'll shoot you. That doesn't help. That just creates more Hulk behavior. Scarlett Johansson is what helps the Incredible Hulk. A trusting person who can calm the Incredible Hulk. So when we think about crisis management, I really think about the art of distraction. What are some soothing things that might distract that individual from the thing that set them off? And I think about three categories of calming sort of distractors. Novel items, things they've never seen before that might grab their attention and get them away from the thing that's bothering them. So all of a sudden, I bring out a gold coin that I got from Slovenia. I did some talks in Slovenia, and I bring these gold coins back to the United States. And when kids are melting down, sometimes I say, hey, did I ever show you this gold coin? And piques their curiosity and shifts them out of that meltdown for a moment. So those are novel ways to distract. We can also look at special interests. All of us have some things that we like that are calming, that are interesting to us. So if I have a kid who loves Walt Disney and all the characters, maybe I have a book on Disney characters, and at that moment of meltdown, let's look at our Disney characters, and that can be calming and soothing. Or it might be a sensory activity that just provides different sensory input that calms the individual. One very simple, common sensory input is food. Food. Sometimes people over rely on food, so we have to be careful. But food can be a very powerful way to shift people's mood when they're upset. It provides a different kind of input all of a sudden to their system. But music can do that, exercise, different kind of sensory input can distract. So the point I'm saying is when someone's at their worst out of control behavior, it may not be a time to sort of threaten punishment or even rewards. It may be instead it's time to sort of, how do I calm you? Right.
Mhm.
And that doesn't mean we're rewarding a meltdown. If somebody's trying to avoid doing something, we want them to understand they don't have to tantrum to get out of it. They can just say, I need a break. But if somebody's trying to avoid something, then and all of a sudden you say, okay, let's watch your SpongeBob video, that could reward a tantrum. So instead, what we want to do is try to get them to ask for that break rather than tantrum for it, right? Um, but if somebody isn't trying to avoid something, they're just mad because somebody looked at them the wrong way, or you went to the supermarket and you didn't buy them the snack that they wanted and they're tantruming. It's not rewarding a tantrum if all of a sudden you listen to their favorite music to calm them down. You're
Mhm.
not rewarding them by going and getting them the snack. You're just trying to get their mind off of it. So that's step two, crisis management. But the bulk of the book, No More Meltdowns, is really about not just putting out fires, these sort of crisis management tools when you have the Incredible Hulk, but figuring out how to prevent the situation where the kid turns into the Incredible Hulk. That is, you have to learn what their triggers are. To answer the why question, why do they keep doing this? You have to find the things that trigger them. And I lay out 7 very common categories of triggers in the No More Meltdown book with some sample prevention plans for all those different triggers. It's really helpful to have a map of potential triggers because when we ask that question, why is my kid doing this? It's hard to know even where to start if it's a mystery. And if I've given you 7 sort of categories of triggers and that's in your head, now you have at least a map of how to figure out, okay, what could have set this kid off. And when you talk about balloons in the grocery store for Joseph, that might come at in that sort of category we call handling sort of disappointments when you don't get what you want.
Mhm. Yeah.
So that's a major category. And so if you have that as a map and you're sort of going through, was it this, was it this, was it this? You start to ask, well, is there something he didn't get that's making him mad? Oh, yeah, balloons, right? And it gives
Yeah.
you a chance to try to get to the information a little quicker. Bridget, would it be useful to give your readers like a quick and dirty explanation of those triggers?
Sure. Yeah.
I don't think we have time to talk about the prevention plans for each of those triggers, but just to give them a map of like, what are we looking for?
Yeah, I feel a teaching moment here. Go for it.
Well, so one of them is just sort of the child's own internal state can be a trigger. We suspect something's going on inside the kid when they're having more problematic behavior, like everywhere you take that kid that day. If everywhere you go, then the trigger is not the environment anymore. The trigger is like inside of them. They're bringing a higher level of problem everywhere. So things like tiredness, hunger, things like pain, people who have GERD, gastroesophageal reflux. So many of our kids have gastrointestinal issues. Kids with difficulty with expressive language may not be able to tell you if they're having an ear infection, dental pain, headaches, migraines, other things. So that's one category. Another category are sensory issues where they're overwhelmed by too much stimulation. So that's a common issue for many folks on the spectrum, that there's too many people, too much noise. But another problem, especially for sort of kids with ADHD, is understimulation. You and I are talking to each other, and if we had a kid sitting and just listening to this, particularly one who has some language challenges, this would be incredibly boring.
Mhm.
It would not be engaging enough to keep that kid's attention. And so sometimes we're looking in the environment, if we are putting a kid in a place where we're just really boring them and not engaging them.
Mhm.
The third trigger is where there's no real structure. And for many of kids on the spectrum, that boils down to there not being enough visual supports to explain what was supposed to happen. One really good example for lots of kids on the spectrum early on in their lives in school is recess. Recess all of a sudden doesn't seem to have any obviously stated rules and visual aids to tell you where you're supposed to stand and be and what to do.
Mhm.
We try to actually add structure for kids at recess. We'll set it up like an amusement park with signs that tell people where the activities are, where they stand to be in line to be the next person to do that activity. But without structure, some kids are going to have, lots of challenges.
Mhm.
Um, the fourth trigger is what we call a sort of demanding task. So all schoolwork, reading and writing, can be a source of frustration if they're not sure how to deal with it. And I would chunk into that category sort of fears and phobias, things that create, a sense of anxiety. So like I had a kid who would never go outside during the summer because he was afraid of insects. And so he missed playtime with his friends every summer for that.
Mhm.
Um, the fifth category are sort of the category of disappointments where you don't get what you want, like Joseph not getting a balloon at the grocery store, um, having to wait for something, having something canceled, a change in schedule. So it's raining out, so we don't get to go outside and play today, that kind of thing, disappointments. The sixth category are what I call threats to self esteem. And these are things where, things that make people feel bad about themselves, like being corrected, making a mistake, losing a game, not being first, somebody criticizing or potentially teasing. These are all potential threats to self esteem, right? And then the last category, number seven, is when people aren't getting the attention that they want. And so the behavioral challenge is either because they're mad that they're being ignored, or they're trying to get attention in ways that really sort of backfire, trying desperately to get people to like them by telling jokes that are actually provocative and upsetting. Sometimes we call these sensitive topics. I have a lot of kids who sort of obsess around, sex, violence, race, religion, and politics. And
Mhm.
these are areas that can actually be really, get you a lot of attention, but sometimes make people not want to be around you.
Wow, I was just so engaged in that because I could see my son in every single one of those. How
Well,
helpful.
all of us can see ourselves, and these are
Yeah.
the kind of triggers. It's I had a supervisor years ago, actually, who was somebody who worked with people with profound illnesses, psychosis, schizophrenia, and he said, "Jed, listen, people with schizophrenia are just like everybody else, only more so." So
Mhm.
the things that I'm talking about tend to be universal human stuff, human issues, human themes. It's just that some people have more of that. The one thing I think I'd like to share with you too is some work from Carol Dweck that I think is really so important for our folks on the spectrum, especially verbal folks on the spectrum. So many people feel when they've had any kind of disability, if they can't do something, they feel dumb. And that is a huge demotivator. If I feel like, oh, I'm dumb if I can't do this, then I don't want to approach it. I'm not even going to try it. And I'm going to quit if I make a mistake. And Carol Dweck's research on growth mindset sort of shows that if you teach people that you're not dumb if you don't understand something, that's part of the learning process. You're not supposed to know things, that you grow over time by trying things and asking for help. The effort and willingness to ask for help is how you learn. And so you're trying to convince people that the only way to learn is to do things they don't quite know yet. And you will make a mistake. And so that doesn't mean you're not smart. That means you're about to learn. Like mistakes key you in to the thing that you need to work on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And getting help doesn't mean you're weak and incompetent. Getting help means you're intelligent. That's what smart people do to learn. And so if you can get this into somebody's head before they struggle with work, hey man, we're about to do this math. By the way, you're not supposed to know this. So we might make some mistakes. And that's good. That means we're learning, and then we're going to get some help to learn it, right? Now, I wouldn't rush into the most difficult work. I use the 80-20 rule. 80% of what they can do easily before the 20% that's difficult. Build confidence first.
Yeah, I love that.
So, if you can sort of front load it with easier items first to build confidence, that's good. But also you have to sort of set the right mind frame for them that, hey, you're not supposed to know this. We're learning it over time. And we learn, so I hope you make a mistake, because if you make a mistake, that means you're learning. And what I do with lots of my students is I tell them, if you make a mistake with your work and then you get help and you learn from it, that's going to be worth more points on a reward chart than if you get the work done the first time. So you get more points, more rewards for making a mistake and handling it than getting it right the first time. And so in that way, we reward the process of learning rather than rewarding the outcome. Well, people who approach life with curiosity, openness, modesty, uh, and a willingness to seek guidance from others, those are the ones who really learn the most, who grow the most.
Yeah.
Well, and when my kids, the kids that I see on the spectrum who transition to, say, a post-secondary school, college, one of the single most key predictors of their ability to succeed in college is their willingness to seek out help, to sort of to learn, to know what they don't know and to get help for it.
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know
And knowing that that's okay. It's okay not to know, I think, is what I see so much, is that it's just maybe they feel embarrassed or, afraid to be wrong. It just really depends
Well,
on
and who blames them, right?
yeah.
Because if you grow up in an environment where people have teased you or people have snickered because you got a special ed help or whatever, if the kids aren't taught at an early age that the person who goes out for extra help isn't dumb, but might be the next Albert Einstein or Bill Gates or Temple Grandin or Marie Curie or Mozart, or Thomas Edison, all of whom had learning differences and some on the spectrum. If nobody's teaching people that, then we end up stigmatizing getting help rather than understanding that, this is how this person is going to grow and may, in fact, make the next invention that sort of cures COVID.
I would like to know what you have learned from working with the autism community, because we're both, you're teaching, you're giving so much. What have you learned?
Well, it's interesting, your story about your son Joseph and some of the language and echolalia he had early on and where he's at now. And one of the lessons I learned sort of early on was to never underestimate a student. And we actually know hope leads to better outcome with teaching too, and in education. There was a study years ago. It's unethical to do this now, but a study years ago called Pygmalion in the Classroom, and they told teachers, we've divided up your class into two groups. We put the sort of high IQ group on one side, the low IQ group on the other. Go ahead and teach them. And at the end of the year, the high IQ group not only had better grades in the classroom, but better standardized scores. Now, the truth was they were randomly selected to the groups. There wasn't a high IQ and low IQ group. But if teachers believe that one group is smarter, they keep teaching to that group. And if they believe another group doesn't have the capability, they kind of give up on their effort to keep teaching that group because, oh, maybe this kid won't get it anyway. And that's an important lesson, just as all the lessons families have taught me over time of kids who had very limited language. And yet there were skills that they had that maybe were, not easily visible early on, and to never sort of underestimate that a kid doesn't understand what you're saying or isn't going to be able to have sort of a big life. I remember one family who the youngster didn't have language early on, and very concrete in many ways, and but mom was a force of nature, maybe like you, Bridget, and she just had big dreams for her kid, and so he is conversational now. And this is a kid who had no language early on, who now is able to negotiate independently a train ride from New Jersey into Penn Station in New York, and from New York, Penn Station, take a subway to a bakery where he decorated cakes because he had some pretty interesting artistic ability.
Mm-hmm.
And has a very big life doing that, and also teaching art to young kids,
Yeah, I love
and
that.
selling his artwork.
So many moms in the autism community talk about the everyday struggles of toilet training, dealing with tantrums, kidding, and many other challenges. In your book, Autistic Logistics,
That's right. Yeah.
yeah, you offer techniques on how to deal with those situations, and I was wondering what is your inspiring child? What would you like to tell us about that? That
I mean, on how to inspire. Okay. Well,
yeah,
you mentioned a lot of things,
yeah.
and I understand the urge for that because there's a lot to talk about. And actually, Autistic Logistics I wrote because every parent I speak to usually has these questions. How can I get my child to pee in the potty? How can I get my child to stop hitting me? What do I do when they cry? How do I get them to brush their teeth? All these kind of questions. How do I get them to eat new foods or just eat at all or go to sleep? All these things. Yeah. So I decided, that I would write a book about it so that it would be instantly helpful for people. But you mentioned toilet training, so I'll just talk about that. So I think that you pick up on a very important part of the book, which it's centered around inspiration. Like our children can learn, they can grow, but they do it uniquely from their own perspective at their own time. And so I think one first place to start is just to step back a little bit and start observing. Start observing what your child loves, what lights them up, what makes them laugh. And sometimes, as a mother guide, you have so many pressures from the outside world to get your child to be different. They've got to get potty trained, otherwise they'll never go to daycare, or they've got to stop hitting, and all of this, that you're so focused on trying to get them to do something different that sometimes you don't take the time or the space just to sit back and see what they love. And because that's one of the most valuable pieces of information that you can have and to use, which I know a lot of the education system tries to discourage, right? But in the Sunrise program and in my work with children, we use what they love and we put it at the center, not as a motivation, but as the center of the game. Because if our children are comfortable and doing what they love, then they're going to learn. That's when they're going to learn. So for instance, our children often love different things, right? So they might love not basically rolling a car, but they might love the spinning of a wheel, or they might love to look at the spinning of a fan. So we would use the idea that they love to spin things, and we'd put it at the center of potty training. So we might put things on the toilet that spin, right? Or actually, here's one fascinating thing to encourage the toilet and to make it more friendly. Mm-hmm. There was one child I worked with who loved to look at ribbons. So she would spin ribbons in front of her eyes and look at it. And her parents, after reading, talking to me, they got a whole load of yellow ribbons and they stuck it all over the toilet. Right. And before you know it, she was starting being interested in the toilet. Why? Because what she loved was there.
Yes. Yeah.
So well, and you know what other one Mom did, which I thought was really, really fantastic, is he loved, this little kid loved airplanes. So she made a runway all the way to the toilet.
I love that.
I know.
Clever. That is so clever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's noticing what they love, what lights them up, and not not trying to avoid that because your children do it a lot, but like really embracing it and putting it around toilet training. And then the other thing was very important around new foods and toilet training is these are things you can't force.
Right.
And these are things that our children have complete control over. So often, and I think this is the key to all autism, and I know you know this as a mum guide, you know it. And all the other mums out there that are going, it's that if we push our children, they dig in because they need control big time. More so than us because their sensory system is so out of whack and is so they take in the world so differently that it can be very ununderstandable or very fragmented for them and very chaotic. So they need to create order.
Yeah.
So if you start pushing them to go to the potty, not only are you like not very fun, your fun goes right out the window.
Yeah.
But more likely they'll dig in there and they'll push back. And I've seen children refuse to pee and refuse to poop, right?
Yeah.
So we want to really make it easy and not be controlling it around it at all. It's very, very important. And I know that sometimes you can be under pressure from other people. And if you feel under pressure and you feel you have a push, just give it a rest. Don't do it for a while until you can get the fun back.
Would you give a couple of examples on how to actually use the techniques you offer?
Which ones? What do you think your audience would love the most?
A lot of them are struggling with tantrums.
Yeah.
And hitting. And so it's very hard for them to go out in public and their days are super stressful. So maybe let's use that.
Well, let's do hitting right now because I know that that's a really big one.
Yeah.
And no matter how old your child is, one of the key things is to flip your attitude around it, because often, when somebody hits somebody, you can view that as somebody's being mean or aggressive or violent even. And, I've been around lots of children who've used hitting, but I would never see them as violent. Your children aren't trying to hurt you, even though they do sometimes. Like if they bite you or scratch you or hit you, you may feel pain, but it's not coming from the intention, oh, I want to hurt mom right now.
Right.
There are other reasons behind it that are different than ours because our children's brains are different. So they're going to be doing things for different reasons. And that's very key to get, because sometimes parents and professionals can feel hurt by it. And then they move away and they start becoming afraid of the children, which means you push it away, which means you're not helping, right?
Right.
So we always like to call it intense energy, because we think that best describes what it is. And there are 4 reasons why people hit, why our children on their spectrum. 4 reasons. So one reason is it's a communication. So I'm finding it really difficult to talk. But if I hit somebody and they give me the thing that they want, okay, talking's difficult, I'm going to hit. Right? So it's purely a communication. It's not being mean. It's not being violent. It's just communicating, right? And, our children give us signals. So if they want something and they hit you, it's a communication.
Mm-hmm.
If they point to something and you say, no, you can't do that, or you ignore them and then they hit you, it's a communication, right? Those are the signs for that one. The second one, which I think is very common with our children, and actually it's very overlooked a lot of the time, which is our children have a different sensory system and they can't expel energy as easily as we can. So it builds up pressure, kind of builds up a lot in their bodies. And often they might bite or squeeze you, or pinch you, or hit you just as a way of releasing that energy. And if you're listening, you might try it at home. Like if you get a ball or something you can bite and bite it really strongly, it's like, it actually relieves tension. Or if you squeeze something really tight, your body actually relaxes. And signs that your child might be, biting or hitting as a way to release tension, you want to look for what's happening just before they bite or hit you. They're saying their sentences more again and again. Donald Duck said quack, Donald Duck said quack. And they're looking kind of a little agitated, but it's like with physical movements. Or it's in the middle of a rough and tumble game, where they're really like super excited or something. And then they bite or then they hit, then it's a buildup of tension in their body. And the technique you want to use to help with that one, right, is if you notice that, then you want to squeeze their hands. Squeeze their hands, really deep pressure all the way up their arms. If you notice they have more energy, squeeze their feet all the way up their legs. Give them a big bear hug. Obviously, only if they allow you. It's not something you want to force on them. But in my experience, children often give me their hands back. They just love it. Squeeze them on their heads. And then if you notice that your child really likes that, then throughout the day, you want to start squeezing them before they get to the state where they've got to bite you. And you want to also communicate to them and say, hey, you don't have to bite me or hit me. Just come to me. I'll always squeeze you. There's a different way that you can let your energy out. Wow. So the third reason kids hit often is because, not on purpose and unintentionally, the adults in their lives aren't listening to the first no. So I'll give an example of this. So I was watching a amazing mom, with this beautiful little 4-year-old girl, and her stim, we call it an ism, but her stim was she would get all these little stuffed animals and she'd talk to them, right? Have little like, one animal saying to the other, and she'd like place them all around her. And her mom would be in front of her, and her mom's like really trying to connect with her. So her mom kept moving the stuffed animal, and she would like take the stuffed animal and put it back where it was and go, and then the mom would move it. Hello, do you want to play with me? And she'd take it from her mom and put it down. And then she'd move her mom gently a little further away. And then her mom would come back and start tickling her feet, and she would take her feet away. And then her mom would place something on the stuffed animal, and she'd take the stuff. So, and then eventually the mom kind of got close into her, and her daughter yanked her hair. Now, when her daughter yanked her hair, she moved all the way over the other room and didn't ever come back again, right? Oh. And then when she came out of the room, I'm like, how you doing? She said, see? Out of the blue, she just pulled my hair. And then luckily we had videotaped it. And I said, well, I think there's something cool here that we can observe. So here she said, no. She said, no. She said, no. She's pushing you away. She's pushing away. You keep coming back. You keep coming back. You keep coming back. And then really the only way she can defend herself is to get bigger. And she pulled hair, and then the person went away. So sometimes in our eagerness to want to help and want to interact, we're not actually listening to our children's first nonverbal no, but we listen when they hit us, right? So we're teaching them that's the only way we can get people in our lives to stop.
Yeah, that's powerful.
So, and sometimes it takes a very brave person to ask the question, ooh, do I do that? Without judging yourself. Because you're only trying to help. But if you could, all those people listening, and if you're a professional very much, because you're under a lot of pressure to get results, right? Is, oh, do I do that? Am I really listening? So you wanna think about what happened just before my child hit. Mm-hmm. Was it because I wasn't respecting their first no? And then when you get the first no, you want to celebrate that. Thank you for telling me no.
Right.
That was such a gentle way to say no. And then you want to respond, because we want to teach that you don't you don't have to hit people to get them to stop. We want to teach that a gesture, we'll respond to a gesture, or we'll respond to language more than we respond to the hit. That's very important for our children, because they're only going to do what works for them.
For me, I just look at it as learning how to communicate with your child, right?
Yeah.
It's just a different way. And so if the mom feels bad, which we all do, because we're all doing our best and we get frustrated. So I think that's a great point that you said, that she's trying to let you know. And so how do I communicate with my child?
No, I really agree with that. And everything that our children are doing, they're doing for a very good reason.
Right.
And it's not to be mean.
No,
it's not.
Try not to take it personal is kind of what I got.
Yeah.
Because I know I did.
Yes. And there's no, no one ever teaches you not to, right?
Yeah.
It's obvious to take it personally.
Yeah. I love that. And okay, so fourth.
Okay, fourth is this usually happens in teenagers and older children, really, because and there are two things I'd look at, and I just want to say, off the cuff, I'm not a doctor and I'm not a dietitian, and I wouldn't do anything unless you're under the direction of a doctor. But sometimes I've had experiences with families whose children are like really going for it. They're breaking windows, they're throwing things, they're screaming, they're having really intense, long periods of, intense energy. And their parents are at their wits' end. And what we come to realize is that these children for a long time have been very over medicated. So they might have been put on an antipsychotic when they were 4, and certain drugs, their doctors kept giving them more drugs, and nobody's really reassessed that over a long period of time, and they build up in your system and they're not working anymore. And only with the help of doctors, I've worked with families who with their doctor have slowly weaned their children off the drugs, and they're fine. No more intense energy, no more nothing. And then sometimes what happens, because our kids are like any other teenager, right? The hormones set in, the moodiness, the unhealthy eating, all of this. And diet and exercise is so important for our children. And I think that in the autism world, especially in schools and in residential homes and all sorts of places, they're not really looking to have a very healthy diet.
Right.
So, and our children can be very sensitive to processed food, very sensitive to gluten, very sensitive to casein, very sensitive to sugar. And sometimes for some reason in teenage years, teenagers to have more sodas than they did when they were 5. They limited it when they were 5, but not really when they were 16. So I would really look into your child's diet, and very, very important. A diet and how many video games they're playing.
Yes.
How many hours are they watching YouTube? So the reduction in YouTube and the internet and diet, again, radically changed a lot of these teenagers' challenges. I mean, they went from being in crisis sometimes into, back to their really sweet, gentle selves.
Mm-hmm. As you're talking, I'm thinking back, and I know that Joseph has had a lot of issues with allergies and all the things you're talking about. There's a lot of signs if we pay attention, but yeah, I so agree with the diet pieces and what
that's
they're
good.
putting into their bodies. Yeah. And the exercise too.
I think it's really useful for every child that I work with is to think of this, what they're doing something for a very good reason, right? They're not being naughty. They're not trying to get one over me. They're doing something because it's helpful for them. So it's up to us to kind of figure out what's useful about this for them, so that we can become detective. We can become on their side. You know?
Joseph and I, our communication, I often felt like I was playing charades a lot. And one day things would be fine with for example, I'll use this Winnie the Pooh video. The very next day, he would scream and run out of the room and hide. And I was like, okay, so what changed from yesterday? So the step-by-step guide, I wish I would have had this, verbal communication. Would you tell us about the methods you use and also give some examples?
Well, one actually, I want to talk a little bit, jumping off what you just said, because I think that's like such a puzzle of autism. Is one day he's really into the Pooh Bear video, you said, right?
Yeah.
And enjoying it and liking it. And the next day he's like, it's like the most terrifying thing in the world, right? And he's not interested in it. And it's so sometimes our children, it's like we have two children all wrapped up in one little bundle.
Yes.
One day you might go and play with, you think, oh, I'm going to go interact with my child. Maybe you play tickle and they're loving it. It's like 3:00 in the afternoon. They enjoy it. They laugh. They look at you. They might even try and say the word. Or if they're verbal, they might say a whole sentence. And you're just having a wonderful interaction. And you feel like, this is so good. And then, in the evening, and it's only like 4 hours later or something, you think, oh, I'm going to do the same thing. He loved that game. And then he turns his back on you, he pushes you away. Maybe he's into just looking at his little figurines or lining up his things, and he's not paying any attention to you. And you think, like, what, doesn't he like it anymore? So basically, we see, and we teach in the Sunrise program, and I teach in my work, is that our children are giving us green light signals and red light signals. And just like that's what you talked about, right? With the video, you had a green light one day with the video and a red light with the other video. And so when your child's looking at you and responding to you and verbalizing to you, and there's a little back and forth, allowing physical contact, those are all green lights. And that's a moment in time when your child's body can respond. They've kind of got things together where they can take in new things and they can interact. So it's a time to teach, right? Because their brain is all available. And then because of our children's sensory systems, there are other times where they're not looking at you and they're not communicating and they're not telling you things that you knew they knew yesterday or could do yesterday or the week before or whatever. And it's like they don't even notice that you're in the room.
Yeah.
And right?
Yeah.
That's a red light. And this is when our children are on overload. And there's just too much that they have to go inside of themselves. And it's like their brain's on a vacation. It's overloaded. It's closed. Just like if we tried to get into the post office, at 12 o'clock at night, we could scream all we like. Nobody in there. It's closed down. And our children can't. It's not that they won't. It's that they can't. It's not a time to learn new things. It's not a time to interact, right? It's a red light. And you'll notice, and you did notice this because you just told me about it, is that, and all you mums, you notice this because you watch your kids, right? Is that our children will do this. They'll go in and out of this red light, green light, red light, green light, and their own pace throughout the day. Some days you have loads of green lights.
Yeah.
And some days you have none. Maybe for weeks you have none. And then suddenly they all pop up again and it goes backwards and forwards. And we don't want to teach language or ask our children to speak when they're in a red light because they're closed for business, right?
I love that.
When you ask is so important. And that's actually what a lot of speech pathologists don't realize. They're trying to do their activities and they're not looking to see is the child in a red light or green light? Are they actually available to learn this? Right.
I did want to know, what do you think is the most important thing for autism moms to remember? And I think we're touching on this now when they're working with their children in their daily challenges.
I think the most important thing is that you are doing the best that you can. And for you to be kind to yourself. And also your children are doing the best that they can. And both of you are doing the best that you can, and really not to judge yourself, but to look for the fabulousness of what you're doing. That is what's going to bring you life. And that is the truth of it. I mean, you're doing amazing things. And to look at what you're doing versus the results of it, because you have no idea when your children are going to bloom.
Yeah.
You know, and all our children bloom at different times. And I have to tell you the story because it's like very touching. I worked with this little boy, and what he loved to do, his stem was he'd take a little pink fringe on it and he'd just stroke the fringe, right? And I was probably worked with him for like 20 hours in 1 week. And for like, I would say at least 19 of those hours, that's what he did. Didn't look at me. He did this, and I did it with him. I stroked my blanket. And then I met him maybe like a year and a half later. We worked with him again. And at this point, his parents had been running a sunrise program for him, and he now could talk, right? And he met me, he hugged me, and he said, Kate, remember when you did this, right? And he told me what I had said and what I'd done last time I was with him. Not only did he have the most powerful memory, but you could look at him and think nothing was happening. But it mattered to him what I did. It mattered to him that I joined him and loved him. And he was aware of me, even though he wasn't able to do anything but that in that moment. So as you're working with your kids, know that what you're doing makes a difference. They're taking it in. Even if they're not able to show you yet that they're taking it in. In my experience, 100% they are.
What are the most common daily battles that you hear about from parents you work with, especially with kids with special needs?
One of the things that's really important to think about first is for us to understand why our child might be doing it. Because how we think about the behavior actually really affects the way we respond, right? Not only with what we do, but how we do it, like, and the energy with which we bring to it, right? So one of the things I really love helping the moms and dads that I work with is to really understand and get into the head of their child as much as we can, right? To have a really good guess as to what it is that their experience might be like in these moments, so that we can be more compassionate, more understanding, which means our approach to them is going to be kinder and softer, which is the way our heart really wants to treat them, right? But not only that, but when we have an idea of why, then we know clearer what to do. And that's really important with the battles, because particularly with the battles that I mentioned, and for example, with like the control battles, that can feel real personal sometimes. If your child is resisting you, right? You're nodding a lot, Richard.
Oh, yeah.
Relate to this?
Oh, yes. Yeah, it can feel very personal. And especially, there's so many different things going on all the time. It's not really just one thing. And most of us are exhausted, stressed out. I can remember being in a constant state of stress, just constantly, because even when there was good behavior, I felt stressed because I thought, when is it going to not be good? What is going to, trigger, the battles that we have? And can you give us some examples of how you apply steps for this? Because I think this will really help relieve some of that stress.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really glad that you shared that, because I have a lot of parents that come and work with me, and that's right. They're struggling in the moment when these battles crop up, but not only that, but they're kind of dreading them the rest of the time, right? And of course, we know, and I know we've talked about this before, that our amazing children have antenna for that, which means that that's another thing that they're kind of having to process when they sense that there's stress coming from us, right? So one of the most important first steps is understanding the why. So let's talk about that for a minute, because we want to understand around like where maybe, let's take, for example, the control battle is coming from. Because particularly with control, it can really feel like it's personal, like you said, right? Mm-hmm. But also that almost like your child is doing it from a place of almost ego, right? That your child kind of wants to like rule the roost a little bit. Like they just kind of want to have their way. And I think that fuels some of the frustration I know in the parents that I work with, because it feels like, oh, I'm battling my child. You know, my child wants to take over and have everything his way, and this is all about him, right? For our children, especially our children on the spectrum, this isn't about ego, right? And it's actually really important to understand this piece, because it's going to help melt some of that frustration that we have, which is going to ultimately, when we're calmer, equip us better to deal with it more effectively, right? Because but for them, this isn't about them wanting to have control so they feel like they're king of the world. This is about having control so that they can process and digest a world that feels out of control for them, right? There are so many things that feel unpredictable, right? That they didn't see coming, that feel difficult for them to process, that when they're saying something like no, or wanting it to go a particular way, or even ignoring you when you ask them something, right? That's just their attempt to get control back. Because when we feel like things are out of control, we want it back, right? We crave it more, right? We need some more of that back in what I call our control cup, right? Which is one of the two fundamentals that I love to teach with parents. The control cup's really important. But how we approach that in terms of understanding, okay, my child needs a little bit more control in order to feel more relaxed, more able to digest their world, right? We're going to come at it really differently if we understand that this is about them being more regulated, right? As versus for their own ego, right? That feels really different. And I know that distinction is really important, but it's not one necessarily that we talk about enough, right? Because in the moment, it can really feel like it's you versus them, right? As versus they're struggling with something and they're just trying to get something back in their control cup so that they're able to digest the world in a different way. And we have to remember that, you know, I mentioned this idea of like, well, we want them to feel like they have a bit more control so they're able to be more relaxed. Because when they are more relaxed, it's their capacity to do the thing that maybe you're asking them to do is going to be greater, right? For sure, right? And we know that for us too, like when we're more relaxed, we have a greater capacity to do more. And not only that, but to see our child more clearly.
Yes.
Because one of the things that happens when we get ourselves into a stress state, right, is that just like because our brains were built when we were cave people, right, all of that cortisol goes rushing around our brain. It's telling us to run away from the bear, right? But actually there is no bear, right? We're just getting stressed about something with our child. And the cortisol is actually toxic for our brain, which means we can't think clearly. We have what I like to call a foggy brain, right? Yes. Which is why, and I know lots of parents come to me with this experience, which is that they may have been taught a tool or they may have read something in a book, but in the moment with their child, when their child is resisting them in this way and they feel stress, they cannot remember those things to do, right? They're just like, lots of moms say to me, I either I see red or my mind goes blank. And then later you remember and then you beat yourself up for it.
Yes.
Right.
The beautiful vicious cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so we want to understand that actually for us too, that you being in a calmer place is going to enable you to see clearly, remember the things that we might be talking about on this podcast, for example, right? But also seeing your child really clearly is really important when we want to be a curious detective as to why it is our child is doing that. Mm-hmm. And it's really hard to see them through that foggy thought if we're getting ourselves frustrated too, right? So we want both of us to be more regulated. We want the child and us as well, right? And I experience myself that gap between sometimes knowing something, right? Like, okay, the tantrum happens, I'm going to do A, B, and C, right? But you're in the moment, you feel that discomfort start, right? And you can't remember it, right? And then later we're like, oh, why didn't I remember that? I knew to do that, right? It's the foggy brain, yes. Which means we need to prioritize. If we want to reduce these daily battles, we need to prioritize our own regulation. We need to prioritize our own comfort. And that can feel a little radical, right? Because we live in a world that teaches us that if we want to change things, we've got to be stressed and judge them, right? And actually, if we want to help our child, especially our child on the spectrum, and reduce these daily battles, we need to start with our own comfort. And that feels really far away in the moment. We want to start with giving ourselves as much grace as we possibly can. Like you just listed all of these things that may be going on for these amazing parents listening, right? you're sleep deprived, right? Maybe you've been really wanting to try and help your child and accessing all of these different resources, trying to help them, right? It's just, I'm so in awe and inspired every day by special needs parents, right? They're just so freaking amazing. And it's such a part of the reason why I do what I do. So if you're listening and calm feels far away, please know that you're not alone, right?
Absolutely.
And this isn't a sign that you've messed up in some way, right? Because no one taught you how to do it yet, and that's okay.
Yes.
Right? We're not born knowing how to do that.
Right.
And the second thing is that we want to start to understand why it is that our child's behavior triggers that kind of stress and frustration, right? And I know that for a lot of the mums and dads that come and work with me, this concept of looking at the way we think is totally new to them, right? And it's really powerful, because what happens is when we're on that treadmill is we're in reaction mode, right? So our child will be resisting us. Maybe we're asking them to, I don't know, put on their shoes or something, and that they don't want to do that, right? And we can feel the frustration rising in ourselves. And it can be really easy in reaction mode to walk away from that and be like, yeah, well, when my child does that, I feel really frustrated, right?
Yes.
That's our experience in the moment, right? But of course, there's this thing that's actually happening between our child putting our shoes on and us reacting in that way. And that's because we're having a thought about what our child is doing, right? But of course, when we're in fast forward mode, there's nowhere we're stopping and being like, oh, hang on a minute. What am I thinking about this, right? It's really hard to do that, which is one of the reasons why it's so powerful to work with someone who's going to enable you to help you find those thoughts. Because if the thoughts are there, that situation is always going to be triggering to us, right? And that's the mindset work, which for me, I always say to the moms I work with, moms and dads, is this is like 90% of the battle. If we can help with the mindset stuff, all of the strategy is going to fall into place, because you will be able to identify the things you're thinking, be able to retrain your mind to think something different, which is going to enable you to be more comfortable, which of course is going to alleviate that foggy brain and enable you to do all of those wonderful things that you've read about or heard about on a podcast or learned in a course.
So that mindset, that what you're speaking about, I think is crucial. And I love that you're talking about it.
Right. Yes. And this is the thing, right? It's so easy. There's so many resources online that will tell you, do this, right? And parents will, and I know, because I have loads of them who come and work with me. They're so frustrated. They're like, I did the courses and I read the manuals and I still can't stay calm, right? Yeah. And it's like, why are we not talking about this gap between maybe the things we've absorbed and know and what feels possible in the moment? And there's this gap here in its mindset. That's why I describe it as like it's 90% of the battle, right?
Yes.
So hard to do on your own when you're in fast forward mode, which is one of the reasons why, reaching out for help with it is really powerful, right? Mm-hmm. Because we're not even aware of it, right? I know that I heard someone describe it once as like our thoughts, which is, just our mindset, is almost like computer programming. Because the computer just functions. We don't see any of that programming that's happening. And, I'm not a technical person, but I'm guessing it's somewhere deep inside the machine, right? We don't see the programming, but actually it's what's causing all of the stuff on the screen to happen. Right?
Yeah, I love that metaphor. Yeah. So we are programmed. And so how do we shift that?
Right. So the first thing is we want to do is, and I'm going to keep saying it because it's so, so important, which is that we want to be really kind to ourselves.
Yes.
Because and I know when I first started doing mindset work, at first I like freaking loved it. And then I got into like some like deep stuff with myself, and I just started using mindset work as a way to like beat myself up deeply. And I remember there being this moment where I said to myself, which was like, hey, Madeleine, either you're going to do this work with like a kindness towards yourself, or else you're just going to not look at your thoughts anymore, because at the moment you're just using this to sledgehammer yourself, right?
Yeah,
and that was a really important moment with me, which is like, okay, how are we going to keep doing this? So for me, I'm you can never say that too much, because what very often I see happens with the mums and the dads that I work with is that they'll uncover a thought and then start to beat themselves up about it. Like, oh, I can't believe I think that way about my child, or, oh, I shouldn't be thinking that way, right? And then suddenly we're just really far away from being able to change it, because we've just heaped a whole ton of like discomfort on top of it, right? So we want to be so kind, so kind. And with that kindness, we want to become aware of our thoughts, right? So if you're listening to this, what I would invite you to do is pinpoint, one recent battle you've had with your child, one very specific snapshot moment in time. And I want you to write down what happened, right? And how you felt, right? And then I want you to write down, just brainstorm a few thoughts that you were having in that moment. Like, what was the thought you were having as you were watching your child? And my quick fire ways of getting to these thoughts, some shortcut thoughts for you, would be to ask yourself, what was I thinking about my child in that moment? And most importantly, what was I thinking about myself in that moment? And write those down. And as you write them down, just check in with yourself. Are you being kind, or are you sledgehammering? All right. It's okay if you're beating yourself up, right? Being kind is like it's a skill to learn to do that, right? And so it's okay if that's difficult, right? But being aware, because we can't change what we're not aware of, right? But of course, and we'll use a really fabulous example that I love. I work with this amazing little guy, and he used to get a lot of physical intensity, and he used to bite me on the fleshy part of my arm, just here. And not only would he do that, but he would then throw his arms like around my neck or around my arm and throw his body weight into it.
Wow.
Right? So, and he was a really strong little guy, and like really like pull his whole body weight through the fleshy part of my arm. And this would happen every day when I was working with him at first. And my arms were like green and purple. And I'd had some training at this point. I knew about mindset, and I knew, this is the thing, I knew being calm would be so much more helpful to me in like loving him in that moment, understanding he was struggling, also to be able to sweetly and gently physically take care of myself, right, and him, right? I knew that was like really important. But every time it was happening, I would get really like triggered, frustrated, upset. I would go back to where I was living after I'd worked with this kid and cry. Right? And I had some really amazing people supporting me at that time. And I remember talking to one of them, and he was really like helping me like pinpoint the thoughts that I was having. And I remember I came to one, which was, I was thinking, oh, this is my fault. This is my fault. Like that somehow in my head, I was thinking, oh, if I done it differently, then he wouldn't be biting me.
Yes.
Right? And so that meant that every time this little guy, who I just love and adore, he's just the sweetest guy, right? Every time he'd be struggling in this way and expressing himself through physically biting me, in my head, this mindset, right, down in the computer programming would go, you're doing something wrong, Madeleine.
Yes.
This is your fault. Right. And so then, of course, my response was like, I'm really uncomfortable. I felt pretty sad and frustrated. Right. And so it was so important. And the reason why I share this example is because, even with someone who's had as much training as I have, there's still going to be moments where we get uncomfortable, and that's okay. Right. Just because we have moments, just because we have tools doesn't mean we should be like just joyously loving and happy all the time. No one's going to do that. We're all a bit messy and a bit magnificent, and that's just great. Right?
It is perfect.
But it's important to share this example because that thought was always going to be there until I changed it. And so every time this little guy struggled and expressed himself in this physical way, I was going to be triggered, which meant that my response was to get uncomfortable, not be able to see quite clearly how to get him off me, right? So maybe I remember the first few times, maybe I did it a little too roughly, right? Because my response was uncomfortable. Sure. And I know I have lots of parents who come to me and their children are physically intense, and we want to be able to take care of both of ourselves physically, but to do that from a place of like deep love and gentleness and slowness as well. So both are okay, like physically, right? And that takes real skill, right? But it takes looking at this mindset, because I couldn't do that from that mindset, right? I was in my head being like, oh, you're just so terrible. You work with these children and look, he's biting you. It's all your fault, Right. And I think it's an important mindset to share because lots of parents have this mindset.
Oh,
when the
yes.
child battles with them as if you've done something wrong, right? And I know that frustration because sometimes when we don't understand why our child is doing something, we just blame the closest person to us. We're like, oh, there's no obvious reason as to why my child is battling me or biting me. Oh, it must be my fault, right? We're the easy person to blame, right? But of course, that doesn't help us help them. So we need to become aware of our thoughts so that then we're able to shift them, right? But becoming aware of them is the first thought. And it's very hard to become aware of them if we're going to just beat ourselves up for everything that we find, right?
Yes. So then you have the awareness of that thought, which is so powerful. It's exactly what you're saying, Madeleine. Then once you can have that, oh my goodness, the awareness, then we can begin to make the shift.
Right. And we have to come up with a different mindset because we can't just get rid of a thought, right?
Right.
And here's a great thing is to know about our brains is our brains are lazy. Our brains like the old thought, the thought that's been repeated multiple times, right?
Yeah.
They don't want to reprogram the computer. They're like, I'm good. I got a thought for this moment. I'm happy to replay it. Oh, he's biting you again. Play the thought. There it is, right? Our brains are lazy.
Yes.
So it takes a little tenacity and practice to retrain our mind. It's like a muscle, right? We can't just go in and bench 100 kilograms. That's my benching mime if you're watching this on YouTube, right? And you can see that I'm not a weightlifter, but our brain's going to use the strongest muscle that we have, right?
Yeah.
And so our thoughts that we've repeated and repeated and repeated, they're so deeply in our computer programming that in order to change them, we have to identify them, right? Come up with something to replace it and then practice that. So to the point where it becomes a stronger muscle, right? And so for me, identifying that thought, it took a little time, right?
Sure.
Because also I was judging myself on top of that for having that thought, right? Which is a whole different piece that I know comes up with parents too, but we won't dive into that. We don't got much time, right?
It goes right along, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for me, it was about changing it to be like, okay, this isn't my fault. My new thought for me to practice was like, oh, this isn't a reflection on me.
Yeah.
Right. And this was so powerful because it freed me, right? Freed me to be able to be comfortable, to come back to like, oh, he's really struggling. Like I knew that he was struggling, but there was more space for that. I had more capacity for that thought once I took myself out of the equation, right?
Yes.
Because it's not a reflection on you if your child is biting or hitting or kicking or battling you or whatever it is that you're currently struggling with. It's not. And I know that before I go to that piece, well, what it will illustrate is that once I had that thought and was able to practice that thought and made that thought stronger, when he went to bite me, and I had the thought of like, okay, this isn't a reflection on you, Madeleine. Like you're not messing this up in some way. He's struggling, right? It put my focus back on him, which meant I was calmer. Yes. I was much more loving towards myself, which meant I had much more kindness and loving towards him, which meant I was able to like really gently like disarm that situation and get his sweet teeth out of my arm, right?
Yes.
And help us both. And not only that, but the thing that was so important for me with this child was I want to show you that no matter what you do, I'm going to greet you with love. So there's no part of you that I'm not going to love, even the part of you that struggles so much that you're like physically intense with me. And that was how I wanted to be with him. And changing this mindset enabled me to get there. Because I know when I talk about that, lots of mums and dads that I work with, they get tearful and they're like, I want to be like that with my child, of course, because in your heart, you love all of them, right? You want to be able to greet these moments with love. And it's so hard to do that fully if we're not aware of our mindset.
So when we're in those situations, so the awareness, the mindset, catching the triggering thought, shifting the thought to something else, as you said, because it doesn't just magically go away because we want it to. we need to replace it. What would you say would be next then? Once we're finally able to get there, right? We've shifted that thought.
Right. So one thing I will quickly say is that we don't want to try and do this in the moment to start with. right? That would be what I call like the PhD level of mindset. because
that would be magic.
Because we're going to be in a stress state, right? We want to do this like later when we're calm down. We got in ourselves a nice glass of Sauvignon Blanc or a cup of tea.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
A couple of biscuit, right? That's when we want to be doing it. Not in the moment, right? I imagine that as you're doing this work outside of that, you may become more aware in the moment. But it's really okay that if in the moment you're not able to immediately switch it, because we want to train our muscles in the gym. We're not going to try and like just go to a weightlifting competition, right?
Right.
We want to do the pre-game work, right? Yeah. And so I think from that place, right? And let's take control battles, for example. It's going to be really important if you're able to get to a place where you're able to change your mindset. And again, it's much easier with help. So reach out for somebody, whether it's a friend to do this exercise with, or a professional like Bridget or I, to that in that moment, you're going to be, first of all, calmer. So you can have less foggy brain. Hurrah. You'll be able to see your child. Yes. So I think from that place, we want to get curious. Right? It's like,
I love that. I love that.
Oh, why are they doing this? Right. And that's so different from like, oh, why are they doing this? Right? and I know because I've been there. Right. So
yes, me too.
You want to make sure no one's using a giant bat to beat themselves over the head as they listen to this. If you're doing the second one, that's okay. Right. You just haven't got there yet. And that's okay. Right. But to get curious as to why our child is doing it, because from there we can start to put ourselves in our child's like perspective, like, oh, okay. So for example, if this is about control, oh, this is about them trying to top up their control cup. Okay. Like now I understand this isn't about me. Here's something I can do to help give them some control, you know? I know I meet lots of parents who think that we have to be hard on ourselves in order to keep motivating ourselves, to keep going forward, right? And we motivate ourselves by being unkind to ourselves and creating that stress, right? No one's taught us to trust in comfort or trust in kindness towards ourselves. Because what happens when we're kinder towards ourselves is that the motivation that you have to help your child, that you've had from the moment you knew they existed, that's like in your heart and pours out of every pore of you, the love you have for your child, that's always going to be there. And we don't trust in that to motivate ourselves. We motivate ourselves in other ways. Right?
Oh, absolutely.
That is always going to be there. And that's one of the things I encourage the parents I work with, like, let's make that your fuel. Because wouldn't that feel nicer to do that as well? Right. And I think that's really powerful, especially for our children who, you know, if they're on the spectrum as well, like to be around someone who's more regulated is certainly going to be easier for them to be around us and want to come to us more. So here's the thing. Comfort gets a bad reputation, like in our society.
Certainly.
So we think if we're comfortable, we'll just be like this puddle.
Right.
Or like a doormat who just like let the world just. And here's the thing, if you are a special needs parent, you got to be like, you're tenacious, you know, you're navigating the professionals and maybe the school system and all those kind of things. So you kind of in some way feel like you have to kind of have your armor on, right? And so we think that being comfortable, like everyone will just walk all over us. I'll never be able to get the resources I need for my child, for example, right? Because we've never done it another way. We've never motivated ourselves with like, whoa, I have this like amazing power inside of me. And it's the love I have for my kid. And there's no freaking way I'm going to let this professional do whatever it is. Right. And we don't empower ourselves in that way. So I think aha moments for the mums and the dads that I work with tend to be around that they didn't realize that if they were kind to themselves, like they say they want, that they think that they're just going to like sit on the sofa for the rest of their lives. Like that they're just, and I think part of that is increased by the fact that you're so tired.
Yes.
Right. So you're like, but what if I do sit on the sofa for like 5 years? I'm that tired. I think I could, Madeleine. Like, what if I just want to go to the Caribbean and not come back? Right.
Yes.
Completely seriously. Those are fears that parents have because we've never done it another way.
I guess what I'm hearing, and tell me where I'm wrong, is when you can truly begin to make that shift. I mean, it is a little bit at a time, very small steps to self-kindness. Everything begins to flow a little better. It doesn't solve every problem. It doesn't mean your child's not going to battle you. It just means that you're going to refuel yourself with love, kindness, and you're going to be able to contribute with a different mindset.
Yeah, I think it's about capacity.
Yeah.
Right. Which is right back to what we were talking about at the beginning, which is what's the point of knowing all of these fantastic things that you may know or have heard or read, right, if you can't access them?
Yes.
Right. So our mindset and getting more comfortable and being able to be kinder to ourselves is because it can sound like it's about, oh, you're just going to have a nicer time, which I know for like amazing powerhouse parents, they're like, yeah, but I want to help my kid, right? I know you want to help your kid. This is about helping your kid.
Exactly.
You can help them better when your capacity is greater. So this is about capacity, right? You need more than strategy. You need the capacity to be able to utilize the things that you know to do. Otherwise, they're just something nice you heard one time.
So what is your advice for moms struggling? Like, what is your best advice for moms listening?
My best advice is reach out for help and know that you're allowed, because just because you need a little help doesn't mean that you have failed or messed up. I think there's this sort of myth that somehow parents should automatically be equipped just because they had the child. Like, you're allowed to ask for help. I think it's actually a sign of strength.
Yes.
For someone to say, you know what, like, I am having these battles. I'm really stressed out by this. I want to be over here. I have this information, but I can't utilize it in the moment. I want to be able to be over there. And it's okay to have someone walk you over the bridge, right? And have a little help. That's a sign of strength for me. I do a dance at my desk for real every time a woman reaches out to me, or a dad, right? Because it's like, yes, well done for doing that, because we live in a society that kind of discourages that. Yeah. And so it, and it doesn't have to be to me. It could be to a friend or to your partner or to somebody, but just say, hey, I'm struggling with this and I want some help, right? That would be the key thing for me.
Beautiful. Yes. If you enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review, and share it on social media. I'm sending you all hope and love. Thanks so much for listening.